Good afternoon, everybody. Volume okay? I'll start with I won't start with an apology. I did try to check as people came in. I think I'm the only one wearing a tie. And I kind of thought it would be that, but Bill Hammond taught me one time that that the swamp is a sacred space, and you enter it like you do at church. So he would take people on swamp walks wearing a tie. That's pretty cool. I want to apologize. This is the third talk that I'm giving this week to 3 different audiences on 3 different subjects. I'm not sure you're going to get my best talk, but I'll do what I can. And the truth is, Serge should probably be giving this talk too, but the organizers really thought it was important if you were here this morning to be able to hear him talk about ponds, and I agree. I mean, that sort of seeing ponds as an emerging habitat. So I'm sort of a backup hitter for Serge. So I know everybody just got settled down, but I don't want anybody to fall asleep. I need you to stand up if you know where Lake Trafford is.
It's like a church.
That's like church. Wait, not yet. That's stay standing. Okay, now think for a second. If I had asked you from here, what direction is it in? Do you know it that well, whether you would have been able to stand up? And I wouldn't have been able to, because I would have pointed that way. But if I'm never unsure about something, I ask Mike Goober, and Mike, it's this way. Okay. Don't sit down yet. Of the folks who are standing up, only remain standing if you've actually ever been there. So now I want just the people who have actually ever been there to stand down. If you haven't ever actually been to Lake Trafford, you got to sit down. All right? Now, sit down if you haven't been there in the last 2 years. Ooh, wow, that's good. If you haven't been to Lake Trafford in the last 2 years, sit down. Okay, good. Now, so I'm going to have a different audience stand up. It might be some of you guys. Who's been here for longer than 20 years? In Southwest Florida. Longer than 20 years. Oh, that's good. This is a cool audience. A lot of people have been here for a long time. Okay, now you can all sit down. I don't think I'll have any more interactive parts of this. So, a lot of you know about Lake Trafford. I'm going to give you my overview. When we get to the question and answer parts, please, if you think I've misrepresented this, because some of the stuff I'll be talking about happened before I got onto this landscape. I'm going to try to make the case for this on a sort of a larger perspective of Lake Trafford being this really complicated system, and that I think sometimes where we get challenged as land managers, as environmental scientists, as ecologists, is that we sometimes confuse problem with symptom, and that we focus on symptom rather than problem. And I think part of the Lake Trafford story is probably tied to that. And then some of my students have heard me say this before. I think it's a powerful truth that ecology is not rocket science. It's much more complicated than that. And I think that if you want to build a bridge, you can build a bridge, and you're done. If you want to create a wetland, like Tim talked about, or if you want to rebuild a lake, that's nothing that you'll ever be done with in this sort of reality that the future is changing. And we've got to continue to keep figuratively and literally our hands in that system to be able to figure out what's going on over time. So I've been working on Lake Trafford for about 10 years. All the work that I've done was funded through the South Florida Water Management District, largely through the foresight of Clarence Tiers that many of you guys know. Early in the restoration process, Clarence said we need to put some money in on monitoring, keeping our fingers in as to what's happening as it's being fixed. A lot of the work was done through our Inland Ecology Research Group. Is Dave here? So Dave Seeley, that you guys know, who's probably outside talking to us. Yeah, there he is, right there. That Dave and I really built together, and then Dave got a real job, but we still work together on projects. And Serge has picked up a lot of what Dave and I did, and has students working on the lake, and that includes some of Dave's and my graduate students, John Ferlita, Juliana DeFroda, Mark Lucius is working out there right now. And then Dave, I was going to say dozens of undergraduate volunteers and interns, but it might actually be hundreds, do you think? I don't know, dozens, hundreds? Yeah. Sometimes numbers matter. So, for the few people who didn't stand up, whereas Lake Trafford, out near Immokalee, within this greater watershed, and the picture that I embedded here is from a pamphlet from the 1970s about fishing at Lake Trafford. Part of the story of Lake Trafford before I was here is that it was a place that people came from far away to catch bass. It was a really good bass fishery. And probably that picture that they had there of, you can't tell from the picture, but a diverse and well-developed riparian zone of submerged and emerged and aquatic vegetation could be the target that we should be aiming for after the initial phases of the restoration. Here's a little bit tighter context. So you can see Mammakli is to the right on this diagram. Pepper Ranch is to the north. You can see now some specific point sources for inflow. Historically, the water came from here and went that way. And periodically, the lake would fill up enough that it would just overflow and flush downstream. Of course, the immediate lake watershed has been significantly modified through land use changes and altered hydrology around it. So I wanted to do real quick some slides of history. Again, before I was here, if I get any of this wrong, I'd really like to hear about it. I remembered thinking that I would have this milestone back the second week of September, and I got so busy I forgot to honor it. I had my 1000th week in South Florida back in September. So think about those kinds of events as you guys are here longer, about how long you're there. So it'll be 20 years for me this summer. So what's happened around Lake Trafford? Agriculture, although a lot of the agriculture is going away, the altered hydrology, and in some cases the nutrient loading associated with production of food. That led to high nutrient levels inside the lake, a nice opportunity for invasive plants to move in. So the way it's described, these are not Lake Trafford pictures, but the way it's described to me was this wonderful bass fishery that people came from all over to turn to something looking like that, where you can't get your boat through it anymore, and you can't fish the way that you want to. So what do we do in that case? And this is where I think maybe it was symptom rather than cause. The problem is the exotics, so we nuke them and we kill them. And so that we can open up the lake so that you can get back in there and fish. But of course, all of that biomass and nitrogen associated with it goes down to the bottom of the lake. Parts of the lake before the restoration, over 1.5 meters of muck, like what Serge held up. What did they call that? Chocolate mousse? That was the bottom of Lake Trafford over this roughly 1,400 acre lake. So what's the impact then of knocking out all of that, mostly hydrilla, and putting all the nutrients and biomass down into the bottom of the lake? Move the lake into a hyper-eutrophic condition, periodic algal blooms, which are going to, as the algae breaks down, going to lower the dissolved oxygen levels, multiple fish kills into the late 80s and early 90s, and by about the time I got here, I was still seeing things of 10,000 fish dead at Lake Trafford, 20,000 fish dead at Lake Trafford. Continued sediment accumulation, and in this case now, significant internal nutrient loading. So you took all that stuff that came in from the watershed and you put it all down the bottom, and now you've got that opportunity to constantly feed those algal blooms with nutrients. So is this a problem? Is that a symptom? Actually, I think that you could look at it both ways, but in either case, if you want to deal with it, you've got to get the muck out of the bottom of the lake. So I'll come back to that. So starting over a decade ago and finishing up in 2010, demucking of the lake. Over $20 million and over 6 million cubic yards of muck removed from the lake through hydraulic dredging. A really significant project. Sometimes I thought, this is the largest lake south of Lake Okeechobee. Is it a pilot study for Lake Okeechobee? Probably not, because Lake Okeechobee is so much bigger. I don't know if we could afford to take the muck out, and I don't know where we put it. It's a challenge for this. And some people, I think, will criticize the restoration project and the water management district because they did it in 2 phases. So they focused first on the center of the lake, the deepest part, with the plan to do a phase 2, which would be to clean up the edges. And between phase 1 and phase 2, we had historic low water levels that made it impossible to do phase 2 promptly. When the water came back up, there was a resuspension of stuff and it settled back down into the middle, and so it looked like it was a massive mistake. I believe what Clarence was thinking, and you guys all know this. I got phase 1 and phase 2, and I truthfully don't know if I'll get the money for phase 2. Because until I got it in the account, I got to do what I got to do. So he concentrated on the middle, thinking he'd get the bulk of it out. So if the money ran out, the edges would be the least important part to clean up. And then who can predict that you're going to get historic low levels that will disrupt it? So there were some aspects of the restoration that created some challenges. So in limnology, and I'm not a trained limnologist, my interest is how ecosystems get changed by irregular events. There is a concept of thinking about multiple possible stable states in aquatic systems. So the way you look at this work from Schaefer in 1990 is down at the bottom is nutrient rich and down up at the top is nutrient poor, oligotrophic, eutrophic, or hypereutrophic. And that when you have a low nutrient lake, the state is pretty stable. You're going to get like the glacial lakes that I knew in Upper Michigan. You know, it pretty much stays where it's going to be. So it's got an ecological state that's stuck here and it's hard to move it off of that. And as you add nutrient loading, you disrupt that stability and you can ultimately drive it down to where you're in a new stable state, which is algae dominated and turbid instead of clear and macrophyte dominated. But again, it's stuck down in there and it's hard to get up. This is a really interesting theoretical construct to think about what happened to Lake Trafford and what's happening to it now. So, I had a field trip yesterday. I was driving with some of my students, and one of the students said to me, do you think that the only way that we're going to solve our environmental problems is to elect the right leaders? I'd imagine most of you guys are feeling like me, like, is it even possible that we're going to be able to elect any good leader in the next couple of years? And I remembered that I was going to put this slide up, and I was able to say to them, it doesn't have to be the good leaders. So I really think what happened in Lake Trafford in terms of restoration could be tied back to Ski and to Ann, who really pulled a lot of community leaders together. I don't know how they did it. I mean, maybe some of you guys know this story better than me, but man, they got people interested, they got meetings together, they lobbied people, and they got the commitment for that restoration. That wasn't a good governor, that wasn't good representatives, that was good citizens and stewards of the landscape that brought about the repair, the initial repair of Lake Trafford. When we got started in 2004, one of my graduate students started by trying to put together a lake model that we could understand what might happen in the future, and ran a series of simulations using the Stella format, and basically tried to let the folks who are funding our work understand that from our perspective, the muck was a symptom and not the problem, and that if we dealt with the problem, then we were going to be demucking the lake 50 years later. And it was just a question of 40 years, 50 years, or 60 years, depending on what you did. And so she played around with things like reduction of overall external inputs, different tendencies for storm events, which could flush out the system, the harvest of submerged aquatic vegetation, like I mentioned to Serge earlier, and fishing. Fishing. A bass is a bag of nutrients. And if you can get somebody to take it home and eat it, your lake's healthier if you can manage that in a sustainable harvest. Pardon me? 10? Okay. All right. So working with Dave, we started to try to, and I think, Dave, that's you up there. But you were younger then, dude. We started looking at different ways of keeping our hands in the lake and being able to track its health, looking at aquatic macroinvertebrates, looking at forage fish. One of our jobs was to fill gaps. FWC was doing a really good job of tracking the sport fish, and then we were trying to figure out what lower down on the trophic levels might look like. We did, and eventually we shifted over to looking at this idea of emergent and submerged aquatic vegetation as being critical. Fish biologists know this. You need something like 30 to 40% of the pond or lake covered to be able to maximize the fish production. Lake Trafford was nothing like that. After the dredging, it looked like those ponds that Serge was showing us this morning. You know, that vegetation ended and you just had mud flats. So we started to plant plants. And we planted plants and they failed because the water went up too fast. And we planted plants and they failed because the water went down too far. And we planted plants and they failed because the water went up again too fast. And we planted plants, and someplace in there, it just came back. And in terms of submerged aquatic vegetation, the lake is on a really good coverage. So this is the same picture of Chelsea right here, who really does look happy. I have no idea why. And then I like this one. I don't know if that was like a restoration dance or alligators stay away from us natives, but In some cases, we were able to bring out student volunteers for some of this planting. I think it was.
Excuse me,
it was
ma'am.
really, yeah.
We had a wonderful surprise though. We planted and Tropical Storm Faye came along and raised the water levels 5 feet. And when the water levels went back down to normal, we saw acres and acres of tape grass begin to show up on the sandbars near where we planted. So we used those as donor sites and started moving them around the lake. And then we started bringing in other plants. In this case, we got potamogeton. And so we started diversifying the palette. Sorry, William.
No, it's okay.
You said failed.
Yeah, what Dave said is true, but
failed.
sometimes, this is something else that Bill told me, is that sometimes the truth of a story isn't as important as whether it's a good story. And what I want to let you guys know is that all of us who are involved in restoration projects will know failure. And I think the lesson is tenacity. You try, you try, you try, you try. And someplace out there is success, and I think that's part of what we have to do. So now we're dealing with a lake that's probably 10 to 15% submerged in aquatic vegetation. Not back to where we want it to be, but it's getting back to where we want to be. And we're starting to look at broader palettes. So this is potamogeton that's going in here. This is some of John Ferlita's work looking at, including John Ferlita's work, and because I'm doing this and not Surge, I only have data that goes to 2014. To me, this is the bad message. These are Secchi disc depths. Our target for restoring is that we should have average Secchi disc depths of 1 meter. That ain't happening. The lake's still pretty turbid. This is John's work where he looked at fluctuations of zooplankton and phytoplankton, and in this case, we think that it's a good indication that we're starting to see a stabilization. So if you just look at broad trends of a lot of fluctuation to less fluctuation, but that also could be, it's so hard to do this work when we realize, like what Sean showed us today, there are these trends over decades that are influencing the results we see over just the first couple of so I got more to do, but I don't want to be really late. But I want Mike, and I want Dave, and I want other people who have been to the lake in the last 2 years to just think for a minute. Where are we? So it was driven down to here through nutrient loading, and I would argue killing exotics and keeping that biomass in place. And it's going back up in this direction. But where do you think we are? You guys think in your head. I don't have a good answer for this. I think we're still down here someplace.
We're in the middle.
You think we're more up here, Mike? Dave?
Somewhere in the middle there. That's kind of, it probably depends on the criteria you use.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no numbers on any of this stuff, okay? Sometimes when I'm feeling bad, I think we got this and we're just pushing that ball back up the hill. And sometimes I think, no, we're starting to get a little pocket there that we can shove the lake into. Dave?
But if you've got muck, you might have one of those. If you've got vegetation, you could have another one.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So that's a picture of part of Lake Trafford. Parts of the lake, the ball's back up into the right bowl. And again, I think, for me, one of the takeaway messages is, like I said at the beginning, that some of the pushback that we're getting now from people that we work with is that the dredging was completed in 2010. So we finished our 5 years post-dredging monitoring. The lake is fixed. From an engineering standpoint, if you think that the restoration was the dredging, they're done. We're not done. It's not there yet. It takes more fingers in the lake. But I think that we can do it. I think when I come to meetings like this, I feel like there's been this big change in the way we do our business, that most people understand that what we're doing is important now. Sometimes they don't know what their choices are, but I feel like we're in that direction where we're going to spend this century fixing stuff we broke. And in some cases, we got to figure out how to fix it because we don't understand it well enough. But I have optimism about Lake Trafford and about this watershed that we're in, and I'll stop there.
Got 2 minutes, so maybe 1 or 2 questions.
We actually have time left. Wait a minute, I got 4 more slides.
I was just up there a couple of days ago, and somebody there told me it's the largest natural lake in Florida. Is that true?
No, Lake Okeechobee is.
how deep is?
No.
No.
Yeah, it's not naturally deeper than probably 3 meters. Deep Lake's probably 4 times that, right? Yeah.
So Lake Okeechobee is not.
Sorry, I didn't mean to be that dismissive.
No, so Lake Okeechobee is not man-made.
Pardon me?
Lake Okeechobee is not
No.
man-made.
Nope. Hang on for a minute. John might be correcting me. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I'm just wondering about the management paradigm of what's driving it. You mentioned 1 meter transparency was the management goal, but if you back up further, it seems like you're targeting that because that creates the paradigm of the classic bass 30% cover structural paradigm that drives. So is largemouth bass sport fishing the primary goal for restoring this lake?
That's a great question, John. I thought you were going to do like one of my questions where there really wasn't a question, you just pontificated for a while. What I skipped over was part of the interesting, complex story. There was a moment in, I think, 2010, 2011, where we discovered that in 1 month, 2 different agencies in 3 different efforts were out on the lake spraying exotics, and they didn't know it. Okay, so again, Clarence stepped up and said, we got to do a better job of coordinating this stuff. So there is now a Lake Trafford management team that meets on a regular basis. I missed the last meeting, so I couldn't say monthly because I'm not sure if we've got the next one scheduled or not. That brings the agencies together to try to come to a common vision of that. So yeah, John, there's people around that table who think the target is a bass sport fishery, or if not bass, then something else that we get a sport fishery. And there's people there who want more wildlife habitat, and there's people there who want to make sure that there can be eco-tours on it, and we argue to try to find some common ground. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I want to get at, because almost all these shallow subtropical lakes are succeeding to a marsh ecosystem anyway. So are we really trying to fight the natural succession in these lakes? And of course, there's nothing natural about the watershed anymore. But so all these things play into what drives the management goal of the process. And,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
sometimes you have to step back and say, is this really what we want to do? Because when I was on the lake in the late 70s, it was about 40% cover of American lotus, and it had massive populations of migratory waterfowl, American coots and so on. And to me, that was a great goal. I may not have caught as many largemouth bass back then, but it was a more balanced and productive ecosystem, looking at other trophic goals. So.
I have other things I would say in response to that, but I should listen more than talk at this point.
All right, thank you so much,
You're
Ben.
welcome. Thank you.